On Press Perspective today, we turn the spotlight onto a Korean-American disability rights activist who's being celebrated for her contributions to the U.S. society. We cover this and more. Do stay with us. Hello and welcome to yet another edition of Press Perspective. It's Wednesday, August 13th here in Seoul. I'm Min Sunhee. Right, it's that time of the week during which we touch upon a number of diverse social stories related to South Korea that made international headlines. For this, I have Kelly Kasulis Cho with the Washington Post here in the studio. Kelly, it's been 2 months since we last had the pleasure of your presence here. Welcome back.
Happy to be back. Thanks.
I also have writer Colin Marshall with us. Colin, it's great to have you here.
Glad to be here after a few days.
Right.
Only a few days.
Right. Colin, as I mentioned in the short clip before we started, a Korean-American disability rights activist has been depicted on a US $250 this year, that is, as part of the American Women Quarters program. First of all, do tell us a bit about this particular program and then touch upon, of course, the significance of the inclusion of the Korean-American activist.
Yes, this program, it's one of, I guess you could say, a series of ongoing programs from the U.S. Mint. They like to change up the quarters and pay tribute to different American phenomena, you could say, with the quarter designs. I think when I was in high school in the U.S., the big one was the U.S. state quarters, this long project of putting out a quarter for each U.S. state. And there were sort of folders, albums you could put your collectible state coins in and all that. This is in a similar model where I think they've been doing the designs for since 2022, I believe. So there are 20 total designs, each design representing one American woman, a notable American woman from some chapter of history. Examples from the past few years. This is a program going through this year. This is the last set, but since the beginning there's been Maya Angelou, I believe, has been one, Eleanor Roosevelt, wife of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and many achievements in her own right besides being the president's wife. There's been the actress Anna May Wong. There's been a variety of heritages, a variety of experiences, a variety of achievements, and including a Korean-American activist is actually in line with, you can sort of trace some of the, some of the paths here. They've had Japanese-American women, they've had Chinese-American women, so it is natural in a sense to have a Korean-American woman, and they've sort of reached the stage of doing activist coins now. There have been different sort of scientists or literary figures, and it's all part of the plan.
Right. And Kelly, what more can you tell us about Stacey Park Milburn and her contributions to the American society?
Yeah, this episode was a great opportunity for me to learn about her. I had not heard of her before, and you know, unfortunately, I had to read about her initially through her obituary in the New York Times. She passed away in 2020 at the age of 33. So she was half Korean, half white American activist. Her father was a U.S. soldier. She was born here in Seoul. Her mother was South Korean, and then they eventually moved to the United States. And she suffered from muscular dystrophy, which meant that she had a hard time kind of, you know, having command over her body in the same way that, you know, people would normally have if they're healthy. And so she was in a wheelchair, and a lot of her activism, you know, she had a lot of intersectional activism from what I read, actually. So for instance, she was a disability rights advocate. So she, there was an example in the New York Times story of her talking about how resourceful she had to be able to use her wheelchair in certain settings. So she was advocating for people to have equal access to environments and to be able to have environments adapted so that people in wheelchairs or with other forms of modifications were able to get around. But she was also an LGBTQIA rights activist. She identified as queer. And she also would advocate for the poor. So for instance, I read that during COVID-19, she actually created this movement to have all these safety kits made and handed out to people in California who are homeless. So things like hand sanitizer, vitamins, COVID masks, medications. And you know, shortly after she did that, she actually passed away from complications related to surgery.
Right. I also actually read up on her. I had not known about her contributions prior to this. Moving forward then, Kelly, this next topic, it's something we touched upon in one of our previous shows, but we are revisiting it given its relevance to our changing values here in the country. A poll by Gallup International shows that more Koreans would choose to have a daughter over a son if they were asked to pick a gender. First of all, could you walk us through the findings of this latest poll, and how do you explain this finding?
Yeah, I thought this poll was very interesting. It certainly got some attention here in South Korea. I think the reason why it was a headline is because Korea is traditionally kind of a patriarchy, if you will, and gender inequality is one of those issues that's constantly underscored. So for instance, my mother's generation, she's in her 50s, it was common for people to keep having children until they were able to have a son. The idea being that the son inherits all of the money, all of the resources, and hopefully takes care of the family. If you can only afford to educate one person in your family, you would educate the son. The son gets first dibs of the food at the table. So when you look at that, I mean, my mother's actually fairly young, and then you see now that people, want to have a daughter. It really changes kind of the context of, people's social preferences. The other thing I will say is, not that this was common, but in Korea and my mother's generation, people wanted a son so bad that if they couldn't have one, they would borrow one from other families. So for instance, like asking your cousin, for instance, to allow you to adopt their son and keeping that a secret. So I mean, there was a desperation actually for people to have a male offspring. And so what this survey shows is that of the people polled, which again, there's limitations there, in South Korea, more people said that they wanted a boy if they had a choice than a girl. So really, it's 28% of people surveyed in Korea said that they wanted a girl, 15% said they wanted a boy, and I think notably 56% said they actually don't care. So it's not as if there's this overwhelming desire for a daughter. And the other thing I will point out about this poll is not actually asking only people who want to have children and are planning on having children. The survey participants really ran the gamut of age. So you're asking people who are well past the ability to have children, or people who are not planning to have children at all, what their preferences are. And as we know, South Korea has the lowest fertility rate or birth rate in the world, and it continues to get worse. So I think there are some issues potentially with the survey itself. The other thing I wanted to point out is that those over 60 and up preferred to have sons still. So you do see some of that age demographic divide in these preferences. But whether or not that will mean that, women are rising in society, I don't know if it's the perfect barometer to measure that. With that said, I mean, South Korean women are more likely to have tertiary education than men. Their incomes are rising. The gender pay gap is still really severe in South Korea, but I think what you've seen is in the last generation or two, women's status in society has certainly risen.
Right. Colin, like I was telling Kelly, we did touch upon this growing preference for daughters over sons a while back in light of an article, I believe, by The Economist. That being said, do you suppose the growing preference for daughters, if you will, may lead to a number of perhaps unexpected social repercussions?
Well, it could be, and unlike many shifts in opinion you see reflected in surveys, sometimes you don't really see them reflected in your actual life. But in my case, I've seen a few examples of the daughter preference. My kids who are going to be born tomorrow, they're boy-girl twins, and my wife made clear her own daughter preference. I think she'd have been even happier with two daughters, but as long as there was one daughter, I think she thought that was all good. And even male friends of mine, one of them, he said, I didn't have a preference, then I taught little kids in Korea, and through that experience came to want a daughter, because he didn't really have any interaction with little girls before, and then he realized, oh, I do want a daughter, and indeed that's what he got. So it worked out well for him, but of course he couldn't choose it, and we couldn't choose it, and this opinion poll did pose that situation, that scenario, if you could choose, and that's really not in effect in Korea. Someone with see, people with daughter preferences, they're not really exercising them except in saying them. If they have a son, their reaction is probably going to be, oh, that's fine. It's not affecting who gets born these days. But you hear reports in the U.S. of not necessarily genetic engineering per se, but embryo screening when you do IVF, and they'll sort of give you some data, what they can, in certain regions of the country, and especially the high-tech sort of clinics you can go to in Silicon Valley and where have you, where they'll have a list of traits that are probable based on analysis of each embryo, and it's like eye color is the one you usually see, but sex is another one. And so I suppose this is on the way. It's not here in Korea, and it's barely extant in the US, but the day will come when this preference can be exercised in terms of what embryo you actually choose to move forward with. So it's not sort of the effect you saw in China with the one-child policy and all the nasty things that resulted leading to more sons, but this is a more, I guess you could say, humane way of doing it, but it still will. The chance for parents to actually act on their preferences will come around. And if you get an imbalance as a result, whether it be for sons or daughters, it's not a good thing. When one sex outnumbers the other, you create an even worse relationship between the sexes, or so it seems. I mean, with a much less dramatic case than China, if you look at New York City, as I understand it, women outnumber men there, and the women themselves are not very happy about that. Bad social dynamics emerge. So I think, yes, the technology improves, and this gives you a way to screen out, for example, diseases that were incurable before. Okay, that's a good thing. And with that technology also comes this sort of, these designer babies, so-called. So yes, we have no choice but to take the good with the bad on that count. It's not, it's not a matter of, it's a matter of technology and not a matter of any one person's choice. But then again, it does manifest in the choice of parents for certain trendy eye colors, boy preference, girl preference. These will be tried, and eventually maybe a balance will be struck.
Right, hopefully. And staying with gender, but moving forward, the New York Times, Kelly, last week published an article highlighting yet again the gender debate here in South Korea. First, Kelly, tell us a bit about the article, and second, your takeaway from it.
Yeah, so what happened essentially was there's a Korean soccer or football player for the Los Angeles FC, and he was giving an interview, and it was raining outside on the field, and the interviewer happened to be a Korean K-pop star from A-Pink. And so there was a screen grab that kind of went viral of her holding up the microphone and holding an umbrella for herself as he's talking into the mic. And then this was contrasted with another image of his British teammate who was holding the umbrella for the interviewer, the K-pop star. And this kind of became a touch point, I think, about chivalry, essentially, saying, this Korean football player was essentially pitted against his teammate and made to seem like he is not chivalrous, and that his Western teammate has better sensibilities about how to treat a woman. Now, is that necessarily true? I don't think so. I think when these moments happen, they're really touch points about much deeper issues and anxieties in Korea. We've seen this happen time and time again, where, for instance, the short haircut of the South Korean Olympian archer became a touch point online of outrage, and it became a question about feminism and this kind of gender war that's been taking hold. I've been a journalist here, I'm going on my 9th year, and I will say, in the time that I've been here, one of the storylines that I've seen really become this cresting wave is the polarization between genders and the gender war, kind of the blowback against men, but also feminism and these changing tides, if you will. And so I think there's been a few moments that were, I think, game changers for this. The Me Too movement that spilled over from the United States to South Korea, as well as that very notable murder of a woman at Gangnam Station. Now, I think, and also the gender pay gap in South Korea is very, very severe. It's interesting that this kind of seemingly harmless and probably meaningless moment between a soccer player and a K-pop star touches on those much deeper angers, but I think that is what's happening. South Korea has a really severe issue with gender inequality. For instance, we know that universally around the world, men males are actually the most likely to commit violent crimes. And what you see is in many countries, if not most countries, the victims of those crimes tend to be males. So we're talking about male-on-male violence or man-on-man violence. In South Korea, women are actually more likely to be the victims of violence, and it's violence perpetrated by men. Women are paid far less than men. Their status, they've entered the workforce and they're more highly educated on average, but they are treated lesser than. And so, you know, I think in this era of cancel culture and memes about dating culture, that's part of this as well, but it's really speaking to deeper issues. And I will say, it's not uniquely Korean. The United States also has moments like this and is also dealing with deep political, financial, education gaps, if you will, between the genders and a further polarization there.
Right, so to a great extent, it is a universal issue as we speak then. Colin, do you believe there is indeed perhaps a difference in the treatment of women by men here in the country as compared to their counterparts over in the West?
Given the differences in the underlying culture, I'd be surprised if there wasn't a difference in that. It manifests in everything else, that too. And the unhealthy ways, the ways that male-female relations here can become very unhealthy, I've seen it chalked up in part to, for example, the separateness, not necessarily literal separateness, but the way the sexes are kind of alien to each other. They're not, how to put it, they don't regard each other in a very realistic way when they grow up. And this can be, so why are men here more violent against women? Often you hear it said, oh, we have to put them on a pedestal growing up, and then we're angry when this is making excuses on their part, but like we're angry because then they treat us badly, but we had to revere them, you know, it's that kind of thing. But so you find, what's the truth of that? What's the core truth? Maybe the relationship between the sexes is there's something wrong to begin with in the way that they're thrown together or not thrown together. And so, you know, you can see how it manifests. Like if you watch the angry YouTubers, whether they're railing against toxic masculinity or the feminist conspiracy or whatever it might be, you can find a kernel of truth in sort of how they grew up, how they came to see the world, basically shaped by the culture that they're in. You can find these things. You can't necessarily take them at face value, because when you're in that form of media, strong opinions cut through the noise, ideology cuts through the noise, and anger cuts through the noise. But I think, again, if you try to just imagine how they came to the opinions they came to, you can understand a little more about how this society works. Now, I wouldn't necessarily say, of course, that it's absolutely better in the US, the relationships between men and women, but I do note that US media, and maybe Western media in general, do tend to cover South Korea and countries like South Korea in a manner that seems like it's working out American issues on a South Korean canvas. The latest New York Times article you were discussing mentions the 4B movement, which has been a subject in the New York Times several times already, and a subject maybe out of proportion to its actual existence, from what one can tell in South Korea. I mean, I'm involved in journalism, and I know a lot of people who are, and I get the impression I don't know anyone who even knows anyone who is identified as 4B. I believe there are such people. I believe there are people who are 4B, you know, no marriage, no dating, no childbirth, no sex, but you have articles in the Western press, the US press, sort of implying or just claiming that this movement is overtaking South Korea. Women have gone on strike. Well, it's not quite like that here, and I think if you live in Korea, you'll know more people, men and women, who actually do want to get married and start a family. They just, for other reasons, non-ideological reasons, economic or other material reasons, haven't been able to. It's not because they've sworn off of it. So, you know, ironic as it is to say, in the media, one needs to be wary of the media portrayal.
Right, for sure. I'm glad you mentioned that, because if I think of it myself, I actually do not really know of anybody personally who's 4B.
Yes,
that's an interesting point.
I'd like to hear of someone who is. I haven't yet.
Right, something to think about. Kelly, one final question before we let you guys go today. Reuters points out that the South Korean military, it's actually shrunk in size given our falling population. Could you tell us a bit about this reality and its implications?
Yeah, this has been a chronic reality that has taken hold in the early 2000s and really accelerated in the 2010s. So at this point, South Korea's male military population has shrunk by 20% in the last 6 years. It's in general, so for instance, in the 2010s, it was about it was about 690,000 in the early 2000s, and now it's about 563,000. So you're talking about a reduction of 150,000 plus soldiers. And materially, why does this matter? I mean, it speaks, number one, to the greater issue of the population crisis and the low birth rate, but also speaks to the security threat of North Korea. So essentially, the idea here is if there are fewer men who are available to man the border and secure South Korea in the event of a war, this makes South Korea even more reliant on its security partners, which we have seen, particularly the United States, sending increasingly mixed messages. On one hand, the alliance is ironclad. On the other hand, Trump wants South Korea to pay more for its troops and really walks into negotiations like he has the upper hand. And so there's this feeling of insecurity on the peninsula in terms of security pacts, also in Europe as well with the NATO alliance. And so it's a concern for the South Korean government because, quite frankly, they want to know that their military is as strong as ever, and it may not be if you have fewer people on the ground. When I saw this question, I first thought of the TV show on Netflix, Crash Landing on You, which is quite popular because I think in the first episode there's this scene where people are able to run from North Korea into South Korea through the inter-Korean border, which is not the traditional way that it's done. It's usually you have to go through China, make your way through Southeast Asia, and then hopefully find your way into South Korea, which is getting extremely hard to do. And the reason why they were able to just run past is because there were very few people at the border, and this one South Korean soldier basically dozed off while watching security cameras. And this is kind of not necessarily fiction. I mean, South Korea has invested more and more in AI and technology to monitor the border instead, and there have been more cases of people getting through to South Korea through the inter-Korean border.
There was a case of the U.S. soldier who was there on a tour.
Who
right,
went north, exactly.
Right. All right, I'm afraid that's all the time we have today. Kelly, as always, thank you so much for your time and your thoughts.
Thank you.
And Colin, thank you very much for your insights.
Thank you.
Right, that ends this edition of Press Perspective. Thank you for watching. See you same time tomorrow.